Hello and welcome to the Hertfordshire Festival of Music. I'm James Francis Brown, the Artistic Director of the festival, and in the days running up to this year's festival, I'll be introducing you to some of the very special performers who will be playing for us this year. Earlier today, I spoke to my good friend, the art historian, Barry Dodge. Barry will be giving a lecture on the relationship between art and music at the Museum of Hertford at 11 o'clock in the morning on June the 11th. Barry is very much a painter with a passion for music, and he is in so many ways a sympathetic communicator of the two art forms. Barry, it's really good to see you. Thanks for joining me on this evening.
Okay.
We
Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. We have lots of long conversations, don't we, Barry? Pretty much every week when we can fit it in. And I've mentioned on a recent post on social media that I really like this sense of camaraderie between practitioners in different art forms. It's not just working on a project, work with an artist. A composer might work with a poet or an artist on a particular project, and yes, that's a collaboration. But it's more the sense of the conversation in the background. You know, the sense that you get excited about something, I get excited about something in our own field, and we want to share. Would you agree with that? Do you feel that's the same? That's the thing we have in common.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we became such close friends is, I met someone who, like myself, you're a musician, a composer. I am. Well, I really regard myself as an art historian first, but someone who paints and has done since the 1970s. But at the same time, I have a very great love of music, and you obviously have a great love of art. So it's quite wonderful that to meet someone and you can talk about art, you can talk about music, and talk about things as well. But yeah, it's.
Well, we met at the concert actually, didn't we? And interestingly, it was Emma Johnson playing at King's Place, wasn't it?
That's right.
I think 6 years ago, something like that.
Yeah. You were wedged in between Haydn and Mozart.
That's right, yes.
And I must admit, at the time, I hadn't actually heard of you, but the piece was so wonderful that I just had to hear it again and meet the person who had written it.
That's nice of you to say. It might look a little bit as though I've paid you to say that, Barry, but let's just go with it, shall we?
I know.
Because I do remember you
true.
and that's the thing. Musicians, it's lovely to hear from people. You know, often people stand back a little bit and think, "Oh, maybe they're terribly busy, or they think they're important." But to hear someone, particularly someone coming from another field in art as well, you think, "Oh, that went across the void," you know.
Oh, absolutely.
One person and another. So I remember that very, very well. And and we've gone on to explore all sorts of things that cross over from each of our art forms as well. I mean, you've told me plenty of times that you listen to music while you're painting, while you're working. I mean, painting as well. I always get the impression you get quite excited. You get a sort of energy from what you're lining to.
Oh, absolutely.
How does that work out, Barry? What's the sort of?
Well, depending on what it is I'm painting, I mean, the sort of things I paint can be extremely varied. You know, from an abstract, a geometric abstract piece to a landscape. So, if, for instance, I'm painting a landscape, then I will often turn to English music of people like E.J. Moyran or Alan Rawsthorne, Vaughan Williams, but it may also be Sibelius. But that music does in some way inspire me, and I can almost whistle along to it as I'm painting.
I mean, it puts you in a certain mood, or is there something about the texture or what it's made of that lines up with your imagination, or does it transport you into another world in some way that you then can?
I think it's that. I think it allows me to enter that world. I mean, that's one of the things about music that I hope we can come back to a bit later, that discovering classical music as I did when I was 18.
Just you told me before, but can you tell me what that moment was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really was an epiphany. I was actually revising for my A levels at the time, and I had a good friend whose parents were listeners of classical music, and he lent me an LP, as it was then, of Holst the Planets. And I listened to this, and there were three movements in particular: Venus, Saturn, and Neptune. And I just, was bowled over, and I kind of, it allowed me to enter into a different sort of imaginative world, and I've never looked back.
I mean, you'd been aware of sort of orchestral symphonic music before then? Do you think it was because you had a private moment with that music in some way, then you started to pay attention to it in a different way that made a difference to your response towards it? I mean, lots of us come across it in all sorts of ways,
I mean, I can remember listening. We used to file into assembly when I was at primary school, and I can remember listening to Vaughan Williams even then, and was it Mendelssohn, Fingal's Cave, and I kind of responded, but not particularly strongly. My parents were never listeners of classical music. But yeah, I mean, I think the other thing was, I mean, for a few years, when I was 16, 17, I'd be listening to sort of prog rock, Pink Floyd, Frank Zappa, King Crimson, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who won't agree with me, but I think in some ways what I was doing by listening to that kind of music was, in a sense, without knowing it, listening to a kind of watered down classical music. And so when I heard the real thing, the planets, wow, this was it. This was what I'd kind of been looking for, and only I didn't know it. Yeah.
Well, you often describe music. I've noticed you're very precise about moments that you want to convey to me have really meant something. And you say you doubt whether you're using a technical the correct technical term, and I always think that actually the way you've expressed what it is about that moment is one of the best ways you could do it. And I would express it in a similar way. I wouldn't use technical terminology. But also you're very attentive to long-term structure in music as well, which often seems, people's eyes glaze over a bit when you sort of think, well, a symphony can last half an hour
or more,
and you're drawn into it as if it's theatre in a way, aren't you? But I got to relate it to art in the sense of how you would describe it in terms of color and composition, in terms of line, maybe. When you're listening to music, do you do something similar?
To be perfectly honest, the thing for me about listening to music, particularly classical music, it, as I've already intimated, it allows me to enter into that imaginative world. And what I often find is that it conjures up images for me. So it's not so much that I see particular colors in the way that someone with synesthesia might respond. But what I often have with certain, not all composers, but certain composers, are really quite strong images. Even to the point where I've tried to paint pictures based on certain parts of certain pieces of music, and I've done this several times with some success. But
the thing we both search for actually is the sense of something, the numinous, something mysterious, something beyond the shadows and those sorts of things. And that's often a relativity thing. And I think you communicate this very beautifully in your own paintings, which I've got a number in my room around me, smallish ones. It's a small room. but that sense of mystery, reaching for something beyond the verbal, the factual, the everyday,
Mm.
and that is
Mm.
something that I've noticed can be very common to both. Let's say, well, actually, no, sculpture, all sorts of plastic arts
Mm.
and painting is
Mm.
a sense of the, it's sometimes an uncanny sense in the composition that there's something that's not been said, something left
Oh, yeah.
unsaid. The Kiriko, we often talk about, don't we?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the word uncanny, I associate with Giorgio de Chirico very much. Um, I like his work very much indeed. And interestingly, perhaps not a coincidence that he had a big influence on one of my very favorite artists, Paul Nash.
Mm.
And one of the things I find in Nash is that he often paints the English landscape, the English countryside, but there's always some strange mystery that you can't quite put your finger on, but it's definitely there. And I
Yeah,
think the sense of the uncanny comes from De Chirico.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yes. And I was thinking also about the nature of, we'll discuss this much more, of course, in your lecture and then
sure.
our conversation afterwards.
Discussion afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about the general relationship between music and art, going back, let's say, over a vast time span,
Mm.
say 1,000 years. Um, we can think of lots of early paintings where you have an object like a violin or a viola or some sort of
Mm.
string instrument, showing that music is in progress. Then
Yeah.
and there's the theatre of it, and we know what that means. But there are also ways of trying to attempt to emulate the condition of music in art.
Mm.
I would say. I think that's your. I'm
Well,
saying
this is
it's your thesis as
one
well.
of the main things that I should be talking about in
Yeah.
the lecture. Yeah.
And would you say that's something that's happened uh, in in a line over time, or is it sporadic? Occasionally artists crop up who will sort of do something. And how would you describe the difference between the presentation of a violin in a painting
Mm.
and the emulation of the spirit of music, Barry? What would you?
Well, I think one of the important lines here is from an art historian that I once worked with, Charles Harrison, sadly now dead. And I remember he said to me once, he said, the thing about modernist art, Barry, is that, modern art becomes more like music and less like literature. And that's really stuck with me because I think that is absolutely true. So if you go back to Fra Angelico or Vermeer or Titian, what you find is they depict someone playing an instrument. Okay. And you've got a narrative. You can then tell a story about this, what might be happening, in a music lesson. The lady is at the Virgin Hills and she's being taught by whoever it might be. And you can begin to kind of get a narrative. What happens in modernist art is that sense of a narrative, literature, if you like, begins to be pushed away. And there's a much greater emphasis on artistic form, all the various aspects of form, line, color, mass, space, tone, etc., etc. You put more and more emphasis on that. And then what happens is that as you start to say, it's not so much what you paint, it's how you paint it, you gradually get to a point where you say, well, why have a subject at all? Just have abstract art.
Yeah.
And that's what happens in modernism.
Often said that the invention of the camera led to that sense that it was no longer a particularly exciting thing to do just to accurately portray the world around us, which allowed that inner sense of shape and line to develop.
Yeah,
and that
absolutely.
process is still ongoing. Barry, you've given lots of lectures over the years on the history of art, and you've also painted, not just
Yeah.
painted, have all sorts of ways of dealing with it.
Yeah.
What fascinates you the most, and what do you want to convey to, a single thing, not necessarily a single thing, but an essence that you'd like to convey to the people that will hopefully come to our talk
Yeah.
about the importance of art for you and music?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think it is kind of philosophical thing, because it's interesting that in the 19th century, and we could kind of discuss why this happens, but it's not just artists. You get a whole number of people who begin to put this emphasis on music. Walter Pater, all art aspires to the condition of music. And as I'm going to talk about in the lecture, you get Schopenhauer, the German philosopher Schopenhauer, saying about one way of overcoming the will, which I won't go into too much here, but the way of doing this is through aesthetic contemplation. But it's music more than any other art form that is able to do this. So you find, throughout the 19th century, there seems to be this sort of greater emphasis on art as a kind of music, or the importance of music in all the arts. And then it really takes off, as I've kind of intimated earlier, it really takes off towards this kind of second half, or towards the end of the 19th century. And, from symbolism and post-impressionism, very quickly you get someone like Cézanne, who starts breaking all of the rules. And, almost overnight, you go from Cézanne into Cubism, from Cubism into geometric abstraction,
It's almost like an exponential speed being pulled towards gravity. But I suspect that might be a slightly controversial statement of Walter Pater's, that the aspiration towards the condition of music, and which makes me think that what we will do at the end of your lecture and at the end of our conversation is invite questions from the audience, because I think that aspect is something many people might have feelings and want to express. So I think we'll invite people to certainly give their full penneth there, shall we?
Would you like me to say something about it now, or do you want to wait until after the lecture?
I think we'll wait till
Okay.
Something, Barry. What do you think?
Yeah.
That would be good. Yeah. So Barry, look, it's been really good to talk. Now I think we've given a little taste of what we might be discussing, but we'll be going into much more detail, and you've got some beautiful images to share with the audience as well. So thank you very much, Barry. Good to see you.
Thank you.